I want to begin by thanking Reverend Watkins for inviting me to be with you this morning. Although I am disappointed that we cannot be together in person. Also, I want to thank the congregation for voting last March to name me Minister Emeritus. I am deeply grateful for your granting me this honorific title on the occasion of my retirement. In 2019, having turned 68, I announced my retirement effective April 1st, 2020. I planned to give my last sermon at the end of March 2020, talking about ministry, thanking you, and wishing you well for the future. Instead, we had a sudden cutoff. Friday, March 13th, 2020, the country shut down. Instead of a tearful in-person last sermon, followed by a retirement cake, my sudden goodbye to you was like Humphrey Bogart's sudden goodbye to Ingrid Bergman at the end of the movie Casablanca. In the midst of the Second World War, Bogart said to Bergman, "I'm no good at being noble, but it does not take much to see that the problems of three little people do not amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world." In the same way, it did not take much to see that my desire to have a prolonged goodbye with all of you in Sarasota did not amount to a hill of beans, given that the world faced a pandemic. I love all of you with much of the same intensity that Bogart loved Bergman in the movie. But because of the pandemic, my time with you ended in a sudden, abrupt goodbye. Today, it's not clear how long it will take for humans to learn how to live with this virus. I do not know the future, but my hope is when the virus is under control, this church will fill with people hungry for a return to face-to-face contact. Needing a community that takes global warming seriously and the threats to democracy seriously, religious liberals will seek out this congregation. In a renaissance of church life, new members and a new minister will have their own exciting ideas about programs and activities in this church. Meanwhile, while we dream of an exciting future, I want to look backward with nostalgia at the time that I served as your minister. I remember meeting with the search committee on the weekend of January 20th, 2011. It happened to be my 60th birthday that day. Although I had years of experience and I was in good health, most churches were not interested in me, preferring candidates who were younger. When my age came up, the search committee assured me that in Sarasota, 60 was very young. I took this as a positive sign. "What is this congregation like?" I asked the committee members. One of them replied, "Well, in Bethesda, Maryland, near Washington, I imagine you have members who have power and influence, deciding our government policies and shaping our national culture." I nodded. "Here in Sarasota," he continued, "the members of our congregation used to have power and influence, deciding our government policies and shaping our culture." After 18 years of serving a church of intensely competitive, ambitious religious liberals, the more serene and peaceful climate of Sarasota attracted me. I was delighted when the search committee called and invited me to come to this city and meet the entire congregation. When you voted to call me as your minister, I was happy to say yes. I remember meeting the church staff. Roberta Durf, Judy McGrath, Robert Luschetti, Kathleen Isabella, and later Don Bryn, Dee Witter, and Catherine Bonner. I also want to mention Mindy Simmons, who was our guest musician many Sundays over the years. I only reasoned that you have to choose good people, trust them, respect them, and encourage their loyalty to the church. It seemed to work. I owe them more than I could ever express. I remember those first few months back in 2011 as we got to know each other. This church is in an excellent location, but unfortunately the sign was parallel to the road instead of perpendicular, making the church difficult to find. One newcomer said they found the church not because of the sign, but because they saw all of the Toyota Priuses in the parking lot. But I don't think we can count on that as a way to attract people. Congregations want ministers who remember that the members are ultimately in charge, so a wise minister needs to be careful to make suggestions, not to try to give orders. Ministers hope that the board and the congregation will see the wisdom of those suggestions. I was delighted that when I talked about the sign, you responded with interest and support. We picked a design, we raised the money. Julie Leach testified before the zoning committee, requesting a special zoning exception, and we created and installed the sign that we have today. It is part of the reason we started to attract a large number of visitors. I remember the work of planning and leading the worship services on Sunday mornings. Although about 30 times each year, I set aside a time of quiet, deep, intense reflection. I search for insights into the problems and the possibilities of human existence. Sunday mornings, after listening to the glorious music from the choir and our other musicians, I would step up to the pulpit and try to give an account of what I discovered. Here in Sarasota, I had the opportunity to use a screen which added a new dimension to the worship service. The task of planning a service was both scary and rewarding. I seldom knew what conclusion I would reach when I picked a sermon topic. It was often a struggle to find my way and to develop an organized, logical, interesting sermon. However, the rewards of discovery, of learning about the nature of things, were very special. The response I found in your questions, your comments, and your faces Sunday morning encouraged me to strive for levels of insight and expression for which I would not otherwise have reached. I love the dignity and the openness of the sanctuary. It would add stature to anyone. I pray that I never cheapened it. I remember the development of our church programs. Religious education for our children was always a priority. In addition, there were Free Thinkers Friday mornings, the chalice groups, Interweave, the potluck Sundays, the movie discussions on Wednesday nights, and Discovering Unitarian Universalists on Saturday mornings, where I reviewed the entire history of our two religious movements in about 30 minutes. I remember the Jesus Seminar program, where once a year for 4 years we brought in New Testament scholars to lecture about the latest research in their fields. I recall the special guest speakers, such as the liberal Christian theologian John Selby Spong and the Henry David Thoreau of the 21st century, the writer Robin Wall Kimmerer. It is a remarkable list of creative activities. I remember the social concerns of the church. We sponsored special programs by Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Planned Parenthood, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and programs on climate change. We held protest marches in support of paying farm workers a fair wage, and marches in favor of calling for rational gun laws. We helped homeless families by sponsoring a home for a family and by providing funds for persons facing eviction. We packed food for children in need. They took the food home from school for the weekends when there is no school meals. One Sunday every month, we gave away the church collection to a local needy program that the Social Justice Committee determined needed our support. I gave sermons on issues such as gun control, global warming, and racial equity. I tried to live a life consistent with what I preached. I wrote letters and emails. I appeared on television and radio, and reporters from the Sarasota Herald-Tribune and the New York Times interviewed me. It was all an effort to explain our faith to the larger world. I remember my 2 visits to our partner church in Transylvania. I love the strong religious humanism of this congregation. In a community that's dominated by conservative Christian churches, we provide a safe space for religious humanists who value reason and logic. We live in a time of widespread rejection of science during this pandemic and the widespread denial that the climate is warming. As religious humanists who operate based on evidence and accepting the authority of science, we play a critical role in this community. Nevertheless, I don't want you to forget that our religious roots are in rational Christianity, roots that go back to 1568 and the Unitarian Christian churches in Transylvania. So my deepest spiritual experiences as a Unitarian Universalist have come from my visits to these churches. The congregation in Transylvania welcomed me and celebrated my presence. One Sunday I gave the sermon in a church building that was nearly 1,000 years old. Allowing me to enter the center of their religious space, they shared their worship with me, and all they knew about me was that I said I was a Unitarian minister from America. I felt that warm feeling that comes from being trusted and respected by strangers. I felt both gratitude and humility. When travel again is safe, I encourage all of you who physically and financially are able to do so to travel to visit our partner church. I remember our involvement in our American Unitarian Universalist Association. An old joke says that Unitarians believe in the brotherhood of man and the neighborhood of Boston. Sarasota is 1,400 miles from the association headquarters in Boston. Still, we were able occasionally to grab the attention of our association leaders. The UUA Executive Vice President, Reverend Harlan Limpert, spoke at my installation. A year later, the president of our association, the Reverend Peter Morales, spoke on a Sunday morning. Reverend Susan Frederick Gray visited here twice after she was elected UUA president, first to deliver a sermon on a Sunday morning, and second to lead an all-day effort on a Saturday in October 2018, urging people to vote for Amendment 4, the constitutional amendment that restored voting rights to an estimated 1.4 million people with a past felony conviction in Florida. Susan and I walked the streets of the city. We rang doorbells at house after house, encouraging people to vote for Amendment 4. We were also blessed to have several other speakers from the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, including the Reverend Mary Catherine Mourn, their president and chief executive officer. I remember my responsibilities to the association. At the start of my Sarasota ministry, I served for several years as a good offices person for other Unitarian Universalist ministers in the area. A good offices person is a minister to ministers within local Unitarian Universalist churches. My primary function was as an advocate for the minister in negotiating resignations from a position in a church. Unitarian Universalists can have high expectations, and sometimes ministers cannot meet those expectations. My role was to help construct a gentle and graceful departure. I remember my wonderful colleagues, who I will never forget. Reverend Brock Leach, who was always available for advice and friendship. I'll never forget Reverend Budfriend Jones, who was always honest and genuinely human. I will never forget the Reverend Beth Miller, who was always caring, learned, and professional. To the list, I would add Reverend Kate Colbert, our intern minister, student minister, whom we ordained. For 2 years, she contributed to the life of this church. I always learned from her probing questions. I remember the moments of individual needs. We are in a metropolitan area of 500,000 people, all trying to survive. There is loneliness, there is failure, there is despair. There is the reality of divorce, the struggles of child raising, and the pain of illness. Within this church, there is talking, touching, sharing, listening, visiting, healing of suffering. It is the highest expression of religion. Finally, while other members are flooding my mind, I remember those who have died. It was my responsibility to be with families in the hours and the hours after a death. Of all the things you called on me to do as your minister, none was more important than to officiate at services celebrating the life of someone who has died. No matter how busy I was, I did my best to give each service the care and the love that all of us deserve. Nothing was more important. 9 years. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to serve as your minister. Every day was an adventure. However, one lesson I've learned in 42 years as a minister, serving 5 churches, is that after we leave, life continues. Imagining this church going on without me is not easy. Still, the evidence is clear. For nearly 70 years, the ministers have come and gone in this church. The Sarasota Unitarian Universalist Church has continued to prosper and grow. Without me, life will continue. Amazing Unitarian Universalist ministers are out there. Some have years of experience in the business world before entering the ministry, and they are wise about organizational management. Some ministers have a PhD in science or philosophy, and they can give intellectually stimulating sermons. Some ministers have trained to be skilled storytellers. Some ministers are experts in Buddhism and meditation. Some ministers have experience as community organizers. Some ministers can sing and some can dance. Who knows, there may even be a minister who has worked in business, has a PhD in the history of science, is an expert on storytelling and Buddhist meditation, has experience as a community organizer, and can also sing and dance. Of course, as a simple parish minister who served churches my entire life, I had none of these special skills. I cannot spell. I have trouble remembering your names. When we sing hymns, Klaus kindly muted the microphone. Yet in spite of my limitations, we had a great 9 years together, in part because you were willing to forgive my imperfections. Your next minister will have many wonderful skills, but like any human, she or he will not be perfect. So please, be gentle, be gracious, be compassionate, as you were with me. For 9 years, I did my best. I led worship. I blessed your marriages. I dedicated your children. I visited you in the hospital, and I officiated at the memorial services of your friends and your relatives. Now it is time for the unique personality and style of a new minister. The next 2 years will be an exciting time to be a member, to be part of this community. As for me, my adventure continues. I have had the privilege of being able to dedicate myself fully and completely to a life of parish ministry, and it's been a wonderful life. But now, for the first time in 42 years, I am happy to have my weekends free of giving sermons. I am living in a modest home in Kensington, Maryland, 1,000 miles north of Sarasota, enjoying retirement. Still, in my heart, there will always be the magic of Sarasota, the modern church on Fruitville Road, and the incredible spirit of a kind and generous congregation. I will not forget you. I will think fondly of all of you, especially during the months of January and February.